Cutler Harbor. You asked me about Cutler Harbor. That's where I was born and raised. Lived there all my days, man and boy, following the sea. Well, I say following the sea. I ain't never done much blue water sailing, mostly just coasting. I've got me a little jib and mainsail boat, the Nancy and Betsy, and me nephew Willie and me, we runs it. We don't carry no hands. We don't need no hands. Though the mainsail is heavy for Willie and me, we just ease the peak and let the mainsail flap. Well, now you'd have thought we'd have known every ripple and reef from here to Eastport and back again. But then again, I recollect that time we was taking on a deck load of lumber for transporting off to Ram Island, and we got in off Goat Head there when there come a hail from shore. It seems they was having a hair-setting party, what you might call a christening. Well, we put in close up under the head and we dropped anchor. We lowered the jib, but we didn't have to lower the mainsail. The mainsail was heavy for Willie and me, so we just eased the peak and let the mainsail flap. Well, we went ashore there, and when I tell you that they had 2 barrels of Barbados rum jacked up there on the beach, you'll understand me when I tell you that they were parting the baby's hair good and proper. Well, after a while, Willie, he started parting a few hairs himself. And I said, Willie, if we're going to get off on this tide, we better get a move on. So we went back aboard the Nancy and Betsy. We weighed anchor. We raised the jib. But we didn't have to raise the mainsail because, you see, we hadn't lowered the mainsail. The mainsail had been heavy for Willie and me, so we had just eased the peak and let the mainsail flap. Well, we raised the peak and we set sail out of there and had gone for no more than 5 minutes when there come in one of them fogs you get around Cutler, so thick you can't see your nose in front of your face. And I said, Willie, where be we? He says, I don't know. Well, I said, Willie, you better go below decks and bring up that coastwise pilot. He brung it up on deck, and it were a tattered edition, and he no sooner got it open to the Cutler page when there come along a little puff of wind, just a zephyr, and blew that page right overboard. I said, Willie, what are we going to do now? He said, I don't know. Well, I said, I think we'd better ponder. So we dropped anchor, we lowered the jib, but we didn't have to lower the mainsail. The mainsail was heavy for Willie and me, so we just eased the peak and let the mainsail flap, and then, oh my Lord, how we did ponder. First Willie pondered, then I pondered. We took turns of pondering, and then all at once it come to me. I said, Willie, I've got it. I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to weigh anchor, we're going to raise the jib, we're going to raise the peak, we're going to set sail out of here, and we're going to keep a sailing, by Godfrey mighty, until we get over into this next page here, and then we'll know where we be. You know, a fella just can't never get away from the sea. I've tried from time to time, but I never did get away from the sea for very long. A fella just can't never get away from the sea. Now, I shall never forget that time I was raking leaves on one of them cold, raw, foggy days you could get along the coast of Maine, and Mr. Smith come out and asked me if I'd like to get warmed up by the fire and have a little something to drink. Well, I said, Mr. Smith, I'd like first rate to get warm, but if it's all the same to you, I'll not have anything to drink. I haven't had anything to drink for over 35 years, Mr. Smith, I said, but I recollect just like it was yesterday that last time I partook of spirits. I was building boats in them days, and I was also building coffins. And I built most of the coffins that them folks are buried in up on the hill. And I just finished a catboat for Henry Furness's boy when Charlie Pierce come over, and he run the general store and did the undertaking on the side, and he said, I've got to have me a coffin by Thursday. I said, Charlie, it's short notice. He said, I know it is, so I brung you over a jug of Jamaica rum. Well, I didn't spare myself none, nor may I say did I spare that rum. And Wednesday night I went to bed feeling pretty good. Very good. And proud of a job well done. In the morning, Charlie come over, and I showed him out to the shed, and I noticed he kind of started some as we walked through the door of that shed, and there that coffin stood, and it had a rudder and a centerboard on it. A fella just can't never get away from the sea. And then there was Aunt Mehitabel. Bless her heart. She was a card from a long line of cards, she was. And she said she was going to get out to California before she died. Well, she just made it. Well, she got out there and she wired us that she'd had a very pleasant trip to California, that she'd gone by way of Bangor, but that she did not like California on account of it was so far from the ocean. And she said she was heading back east as fast as she could. Well, she got on the train and got as far as Sacramento when she come down with the cholera morblis, and on top of that, the tizzic. The cholera morblis will fell an ox, but it took the tizzic to drop Aunt Mehitabel. She passed away on the train, and we wired the station master to crate her up and ship her east. And she arrived 5 days later at Cutler Siding. We rushed her through the funeral services. It was the middle of August. Then we got her out to the graveyard and was about to lower her away when curiosity got the best of us, and we pried up aboard to have a last look-see, and there, inside, was an admiral in full dress uniform, making the best of an unsettling situation. We lowered the admiral and buried him quick, in the hopes that somewhere Aunt Mehitabel would be getting a 21-gun salute. My wife asked me if I would care to bring her mother out for a spin fishing of a Sunday afternoon. Well, I hadn't seen the old girl in over 20 years, and I was some anxious to see just how she was getting on. But I was a bit fearful, because that last time I remembered the old girl, she was working her way up in tonnage. Well, I don't mind tonnage in a woman. There's shade in the summer and warmth in the winter. But when they start working their way up in tonnage, that is where you get your problems. Because the more they ton, the more they talk. And so you can imagine how my heart jumped right up into my throat when I saw the car that old lady was driving in. It was all slanted over onto the driver's side. Even after she got out of the car. Well, we had to winch her aboard. We lowered her real easy. We didn't want a stove in the bottom. And we set her down right in the middle, because we didn't want to spend the rest of the day going around in circles. And we was no more than 5 minutes offshore when that old lady started in. You couldn't squeeze a word in edgewise with a shoehorn. But we figured we knew how we could fix her. Slow her down a bit. So we headed for Otter Ledge. Now, Otter Ledge is good fishing grounds. And it's nice because the tide sets you one way and the swell sets you t'other, and you don't have to anchor to nothing. You end up at the same place at the end of the day as you started in the beginning. And as you can imagine, it's very choppy. We put first one rail under, then t'other, and that seemed to make her a little bit more thoughtful, you might say. Well, she got more and more quiet. Then she commenced to breathe quite hard. And she got quite peaked and a little green, and then she let out a low moan. And she flopped right over in the bilge. Well, we figured she knew best. So we kept a fishing, and soon as we'd catch a fish, we'd unhook it and slap it right down in the bilge there. Well, along toward the end of the afternoon, that old lady heaved up over the starboard rail. We had to rush to port in order to remain upright. And at just that moment, a large wave come along and lifted that lady right up out of the boat. Well, you know, them large ladies is all flotation from the waist up. Well, she must have been all ballast from the waist down, because she sunk right out of sight like a stone. Just left a little whirlpool in the water where she was. And Willie and me, we must have poked around for her for fully 15 minutes with the gaffs before we figured we'd done about as much as we could. And we headed for shore, and I can tell you that my wife was some upset when we told her what had happened. But we tried to calm her down, but telling her that her mother'd be back up in another 10 days. Well, sure enough, 2 weeks later it was, we was out hauling traps, had an awful hard time hauling one trap. We finally got it up over the rail there, and there was that large lady draped right over the top. And you know, there must have been a good 12 dozen lobsters all muckled right onto her. Well, says Willie, what are we going to do with her? I says, I don't know. But what with the poverty of the fishing, I said, I think we'd better peg them lobsters and set her again. Well, it weren't but a few years later that I took a new stern man, a fellow by the name of BERT. And I shall never forget that morning when BERT and I come down to the dock about 5 o'clock. BERT went into the bait shack to fetch the traps, the chum and the slicker, and I went down on the dock to start up the Bluebird. It was cold as I stepped into the cockpit to loosen her up with a few turns. Saw, saw, saw. I told you it was cold, so I advanced the spark, gave it a bit more choke, a little bit more throttle, and started in again in earnest. Saw, saw, pum, 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 pum. I got it humming. Well, BERT come down on the dock with the trap and the slickers and the chum. Throw 'em aboard, BERT. BERT threw 'em aboard. Cast off the bow, BERT. He cast off the bow, he cast off the stern, loosed the springer, hopped aboard, gave the dock a shove with the gaff, and the Bluebird slithered out into harbor. That was the Bluebird slithering out into harbor. Now that old Knox make and break one-lunger engine may sound rough running to your ears, but you know, if that engine would fire once every 12 strokes, it was running smooth. And that big old heavy flywheel onto it would, well, it was heavy enough to carry that engine in between explosions. We hit number 2 about on schedule when we could feel a cold breeze coming in off the ocean, heavy with humdiday. That was the breeze. Off to starboard, old greasy frog light started in a thumping. Ooh-ah. Ooh-ah. That were old greasy frog. And along the horizon were a dark, ominous-looking cloud a-hovering atop the waves. It was a fog bank, and it weren't but a few minutes, for the fog was so thick I couldn't see Bert and he couldn't see me. So I told Bert to cut engine so as we could listen for the Bangor packet about due through at that time. Cut engine, Bert. Goddamn flywheel. Bert cut engine. That was the Bangor packet, a half-mile to starboard. Give a blast to the horn, Bert. That was the packet, a quarter-mile to starboard. Give it another one, Bert. That were a good one, Bert. But it weren't good enough. Out of the fog, an eighth of a mile to starboard, come the Bangor packet, bearing down at a good 10-knot clip straight for the Bluebird. The packet smocked the Bluebird about midships and drove on through her like green corn goes through the new maid. You know, that can be quite startling. The water come up to our necks before we decided to swim for it. I dove down about 2-3 fathoms so as to avoid the 2 whirring paddle wheels of the packet as she went on top. Them were the paddle wheels. I come up to the other side and cried out, "Bert, are you there?" There was no answer, so I thrashed about in the water till I struck upon a hard object beneath the surface, reached down, grabbed the hold, pulled it up, and it was Bert. And he was half full of water, so I gave him a good squeeze, got most of the water out of him. None of that mouth-to-mouth business for me. And the tide carried us alongside a bell buoy. I clomb atop it, pulled Bert up beside me, emptied him out complete, and we were near dry as two wishbones by the time a fishing smack spied us through the fog, come up alongside, hauled us aboard, and brung us back into Cutler Harbor. Now I want to extend an invitation to all you fine ladies and gentlemen gathered here this evening at the University of Maine at Orono. If you're ever up west, not down east, but up west, and you want to go swimming, sightseeing, fishing, you can always do it aboard the Bluebird II with Bert and I. Hetty and me decided to try and get as far away from the sea as we could. So we headed inland and settled on a little farm not far from Skowhegan. And she, being a farm girl, said, "You know, Virgie, plant early, harvest early when you're in this business." Well, it weren't long before she gave birth to a baby boy. Well, she said that he was some cunning, but you know, you could have got me a sharp knife and a soft piece of white pine, and I could have whittled you a better-looking baby than the one we got. He come out weighing 3 pounds, 5 ounces. Hetty says, "I barely got my bait back." Well, you know, it was nothing but mud and frost and mud. As soon as the frost would end in the spring, the mud would commence, and it wouldn't stop until the frost commenced in the fall. Hetty and me, we headed even further inland. We did this by going to the Skowhegan Fair, where they had an ascension of a lighter-than-air balloon on the last day, and we got right up close to that balloon, jumped aboard the gondola, and they loosed the lines, and we were up out of sight before they could do anything about it, and the wind blew us westward. We saw a farmer plowing in the field. I cried out, "Where are we?" He didn't even look up. He just said, "You're in a balloon, you damn fools." Well, the wind carried us even further inland until we come to the woods of Maine, and I saw a clearing, let the gas out the balloon, come down light as a feather. I didn't waste no time. I built a cabin in the woods, and then I hauled some old oil drums from a nearby railroad siding, and I welded and soldered them together as best I could and come up with a stove that was a strange-looking contraption. The draft hole come in the top, and the stovepipe went out the bottom, but you know, I knew that that stove was going to have one heck of a draft. And some of the local guide fellas come over, and they laughed at that stove, and they laughed at me, but I warned them that that stove was going to have one heck of a draft, and they'd better stand back when it started up. I went off to the woodshed to fetch an armload of hardwood that would burn slow and easy. I didn't want to have no nuclear reaction. Well, sir, I was heading back toward the cabin when the most awful roaring sound started up. Who put softwood in that stove? You put kindling in it, you started it up, and it's going much too strong, you damn fools. Well, I had a hard time getting back into that cabin. I had to grip the sides of the door frame. Such was the suction coming out of that stove. And them guide fellows was holding on to the insides of that cabin with their teeth and fingernails dug right into the walls. And their legs are flapping in midair. Well, there's a clatter, an awful clatter. And first the lid lifter, then the stoker, then the shovel was sucked right in through the draft and rattled out the chimney. And then there was an awful wrench, and that stove lifted up off the cabin floor and come to rest against the splits of the roof. I say come to rest, it weren't but a minute, for there was another ungodly wrench. And the cabin lifted right up off its foundations. Well, I knew right then and there we had a stove with one heck of a draft. I got up on top of a chair and grabbed a hold of that damper handle, and with great presence of mind, I ever so slowly turned that damper handle toward the closed position, thereby easing the cabin back down to its foundations. And ever so gentle lowering the stove back down to the cabin floor. I turned the damper all the way off, shut the draft, the roaring subsided, and one of them fool guides, who had returned to the upright, he had the audacity to say, "You know, Virgie, if you had had a governor on that stove, then that wouldn't have happened." I said, "Governor, heck, you put softwood in that stove, and not even the President of the United States is going to hold it down." Well, sir, fella's got to know how to shoot a gun if he's going to be a Maine guide, and I asked one of them local fellas to come over and give me instructions. He brung over an old rusted out .22 squirrel gun. And he said, "Virgie, you see them tracks at your feet?" He said, "Them is rabbit tracks, and at the end of them is your breakfast." Well, I said, "I thought you were going to show me how to shoot this gun." He said, "Experience is the best teacher, now go to it, Virgie." And he struck me on the back, and I staggered off into the woods, following them rabbit tracks. Now, I hadn't gone more than 100 yards before I come to the side of a hill, and I heard a roaring sound, and it was a bear coming up after me. And I heard a screeching, and it was a mountain lion coming down after me. Well, I determined to take the bear on first. And he come at me with his mouth wide open, and I put my back to a tree, and I stood my ground. And there he was. He come closer, and I stuck my hand right into his mouth and down his throat, through his intestines, and out the other side. Well, then I grabbed a hold of his tail, and I gave one heck of a yank, and pulled that bear right inside out. Of course, that bear kept it going, but it was in the other direction. Now, at just that moment, the mountain lion was almost on me when we heard a pack of wolves closing in on the two of us. And I looked at the mountain lion and he looked at me, and we figured that whatever our differences was, we'd take the wolves on first. I no sooner got the stockade built when them wolves was on us, and there was a great tremendous battle, and inside of 10 minutes all them wolves was killed. And I looked at the mountain lion and he looked at me, and we figured that whatever our troubles was, they was over. And he turned on his heels, walked back up on the hill. I turned on my heels, walked down the hill following them rabbit tracks. Now, I hadn't gone more than another 100 yards before I come to the side of a stream, and I was about to ford that stream when I spied two foxes on the opposite bank. And they was foaming at the mouth, and their eyes was starting out of their heads, and I could see they had rabies, and they were going to bite me if they could. So I drew a bead right in between them two foxes. I didn't know which one to fire at. And I was about to squeeze off the last round when I heard a honking sound, and I looked up overhead, and there was 12 wild geese heading south, and I heard a quacking. There was 12 wild ducks heading north. Well, I was so tempted to fire at them birds, but I determined to take the danger on first, and I squeezed off the last round, and the gun exploded in my face. It was rusted out, as you will remember. Now the butt of the gun flew north and knocked down all 12 geese. The barrel of the gun flew south and skewered all 12 ducks. The bullet sped true to its mark, struck a rock, split it in two, and killed both foxes. The kick of the explosion was such as to knock me into the stream behind, and when I come to, my right hand was on an otter's head, my left hand was on a beaver's tail, and my trouser pockets were so full of trout that a button popped off my fly and killed the rabbit. That's what you might call beginner's luck. So I become a guide. And my first customer come up from New York. Oh, he was a little wet behind the ears, so I sent him off to the spring to get a pail of water, and he come back inside that cabin in 1 minute time, all feather white with fear, and that empty pail a-rattling in his right hand. I said, "What on earth is the matter with you?" Oh, he said, "There's a bear, and he's standing up to his belt line in that spring." A bear out in that spring? Well, I said, for heaven's sakes, that bear is just as afraid of you as you are of him. Oh, well then, he said, in that case, then that water wouldn't be fitting for to drink anyhow. You know, I did not do good as a guide, neither. So I did what most people do when they can't do much of anything at all: specialize. I determined that I was going to learn how to call moose better than anyone in the region. So I went to take some lessons from an elderly Franco-American gentleman by the name of Mr. Gagnon. He lived in a cabin not more than 10 miles away from where I lived, I knocked on his door. Minute later, he opened up. Do you do moose calling, Mr. Gagnon? Ah, oui. I am Gagnon. The world champion musculaire. I was born champion musculaire. When I was born 87 years ago in this cabin, I let out a olaire. The way babies do when they are born. And 3 moose walk through the door. Maman and Papa, they realize that I am instant prodigy. Some years later, the governor of the state of Maine, he is holding a moose count. And he knows that Gagnon is the only man in the state who can get all the moose together at one time. So I go up to the top of Mount Katahdin, the highest peak in the state, and from this high perch, I let out my famous moose olaire. Woo! We wait 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. Then we hear echo in the distance. It was the echo of Cadillac Montagne. There is cloud of dust everywhere, from horizon to horizon. It was moose stampede. In 5 minutes, I am able to count 3,487,563 moose, 3 Alaska caribou, and 1 dog with Hawaiian license tag. Last year, a group of New York sportsmen asked Gagnon down to the big city to give a demonstration of his famous moose olaire. Well, I am very nervous. I have moose insurance for myself, but not for 9 million people. But anyway, what the heck? I go down to the big city and after the big meal in the big hall there, I give my moose olaire. Woo! We wait 1, 2, 3 minutes and we hear. It was the echo of the World Trade Center. There is clatter of hoofs in the hallway. We see the ugly nose, the mournful eyes, the massive rack of horn, the powerful fore-quarter, the gigantic hind quarter of full-grown bull moose, pawing the red plush carpet. The sportsmen, they dive down behind their tables and chairs, Sportsman, I give little moose whimper. The moose walk to the corner like a baby. The next morning, I bring that moose back with me on the train to Maine. I let him off in Greenville Junction, the heart of the Maine woods. And I think I see he walk very stiff-legged for a moose. And I think I see little trickle of sawdust come out of one nostril. Sure enough, 5 days later, I receive a letter from one of the sportsmen in which there is a clipping from the New York Times, which reports the mysterious disappearance of the moose from the glass case at the Museum of Natural History. I am gagnant world champion musculaire. I took a job aboard one of them log booming vessels on Moosehead Lake. They haul logs from one end of the lake to the other in big rafts, and I enjoyed that job particularly on Sundays in the fall when we could go turkey hunting. We'd nose the vessel up against one of them islands on Moosehead that was covered with wild turkeys. We'd loose our turkey hunting dogs, and inside of 5 minutes, them dogs would corral them turkeys onto the decks of the vessel. And then we'd staple the turkeys' feet to the decks. And we'd head for home with a year's supply. Well, so that scheme worked real good, except for that last year when the head turkey, he must have been the head turkey, he started flapping his wings. Of course, all the rest of the turkeys followed suit, and I begun to think I might be another Lindbergh. When I determined we'd have to do something, so I released one bird at a time, and we lowered that vessel down and lit light as a feather on a large body of water. We headed east, then north, then south, didn't strike nothing, finally headed due west. And 3 days later, we come upon a headland that seemed very familiar. It was Cutler Harbor. Cutler Harbor, that's where I was born and raised. Lived there all my days, man and boy, following the sea. Well, I say following the sea. I ain't never done much blue water sailing, mostly just coasting. You know, I've tried for years and years, but I never did succeed. Because, you know, a fella just can't never get away from the sea. Thank you.